Well, hello, everybody. Charlie Scott asked me if I would be willing to record a brief lecture for you as part of Seniors College, and happy to do that. I've been kind of scrambling around. I told him that I thought that I would probably do a talk on something to do with, tourism, since I have tourism on the brain currently, because myself and Alan McCachran have been working on a history of the tourism industry on Prince Edward Island, which is finally getting ready for the publisher. But as I cast my mind back, um, it's been a while since I've talked about a couple of storms that were once a staple of my lecture life, and which I've spent some time researching and writing about, and how those storms have been preserved, mutated, or not preserved in memory, in popular memory. So here we are in hurricane season. There's a new hurricane bearing down on the Yucatan and on the United States. We've had our brush with hurricane this year and last year. We've had hurricane uh, issues in recent time. So I thought, okay, maybe that's what I'll do. So this is a lecture about the Yankee Gale and the August Gale, and how they are remembered and forgotten. Back in the early 1990s, I got inveigled into doing a lecture on the Yankee Gale as part of the Island lecture series, of which I was an organizer. And I had done some research on the Yankee Gale as part of the research on a history of the fishery on Prince Edward Island written by someone else. And I had all these files that had not gotten used. Anyway, it turned out to be a very popular talk. I must have given the talk on the Yankee Gale 50 times. I used to do it for Elder Hostel. I did it 3 times that year. I gave that lecture in O'Leary. In fact, I gave it twice. This is the only time I've had 2 people come to a lecture. On that occasion, so many people came to the museum in O'Leary that they didn't have enough room for them. And so I agreed to give the talk twice. If people wanted to wait around for 50 minutes, I would give the talk to a room full of people, and then they would file out and I would give the talk again. Anyway, after that talk, an elderly gentleman came up to me, probably in his 80s, and he said that he remembered a story about his father, how as a very young man, his father had been caught out in the Yankee Gale, and his family presumed he was lost. And when he came to the door, he survived the storm. And when he came to the door, everybody was down at the shore looking for his body. It's a long drive from O'Leary to Charlottetown. And as I drove home that night, I thought about that. I didn't doubt the person's story, but I realized that chronologically it was impossible. The Yankee Gale was October 3rd to 5th, 1851. So even if his father was a very young boy at sea in 1851, and even if he married late, it was highly unlikely that he could have produced offspring who were still alive in the 1990s. But if, in fact, the story about his father referred to the great August Gale of August 24th and 25th, 1873, then it is possible. And that started me thinking. When I talked about the Yankee Gale, many people in my audience had heard about the Yankee Gale. They may have misconstrued it a little bit. They may have thought it was the name of a ship, but a lot of people knew it was the worst storm in island history that killed a bunch of people. But when I mentioned the August Gale, no one had heard of it, even though the August Gale was arguably a more powerful storm and caused considerable loss of life on Prince Edward Island. It was a regional event, and it killed hundreds of people across the Gulf of St. Lawrence and in Nova Scotia's Atlantic coast. But it's been forgotten. So that's what this lecture is about. he said, trying to share his slides. Here we go. Again, I've been very unhappy with the Collaborate, which is the platform that I'm using for recording my lectures this term. I spent a lot of time designing slides, and it mangles them by the way that it shows them. So the Yankee Gale, the August Gale in popular culture, a meditation on memory. We were once a society that went to the sea in ships. Islanders built ships, and they sailed those ships all through the region, across the Atlantic, and even around the world. Islanders also hired out in the fisheries. And even when we didn't have a fishery to speak of ourselves, islanders were being employed by other fishing fleets to fish for them. So this is just a little map showing you some of the fishing grounds, the important fishing grounds in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And I want to point out to you particularly the fishery that is most involved in these two storm stories, and that's mackerel fishery. Even today, I have a cottage in Cable Head, and from August to October, if you get up early in the morning and you look out, you can see vessels out fishing mackerel still. But as an industry, mackerel collapsed in the mid-1880s and has never really recovered. But from 1830 until about the mid-1880s, it was a major international industry, because the best and greatest number of mackerel in our part of the world were found every summer, having come north, migrated north into the Gulf of St. Lawrence and feeding on the nutrient-rich waters of the Gulf of St. Lawrence. They were found particularly in three places: Chaleur Bay, just below the Gaspé, the Magdalen Islands, and particularly between mid-August and early October along the north shore of Prince Edward Island. In the beginning, the fishery was prosecuted mainly by Americans coming from fishing ports scattered from Maine through Connecticut, but particularly from Massachusetts. And this is the Prince Edward Island they frequented in 1851. The American mackerel fleet numbered something like 600, 650 vessels. They made as many as 2 fairs, sometimes 3 fairs a summer, sailing up into the Gulf of St. Lawrence to jig for mackerel. Later on, they would be using seine nets. So in the interest of going quickly, I won't tell you all the stories. In fact, bit of a spoiler alert, this lecture is not primarily stories about the 2 storms. It's how the 2 storms were remembered. This is part 1, the Yankee Gale, October 3rd to 5th, 1851. And this is a painting by George Thresher, painted in the immediate aftermath of the Yankee Gale, probably based on his imagination and eyewitness reports. I have a feeling he was not on the North Shore witnessing what happened. Because what happened was that a large portion of the American mackerel fleet, along with vessels from Nova Scotia and some Prince Edward Island vessels, were caught on the waist of the island. The island sags like a clothesline from North Cape, East Point, and they were fishing close inshore on a very still, heavy, overcast day when a vicious northeaster came up. And it blew from Friday evening until Sunday morning. And it caught the American mackerel fleet between the hammer of the storm and the anvil of the outpost, and it was smashed to pieces. Difficult to know exactly how many people were killed or how many vessels were lost. A lot of vessels were run aground but refloated. Luckily, the island is a mostly sandy shore. But this is the late marine artist Steve Clement, his lovely engraving, stolen from the Island magazine, of the American fleet as the storm clouds started to gather. They couldn't stand out to sea because there was no wind, and when the wind came, it came quickly, pulled around to the northeast, and they were trapped. They didn't have enough sea room to stand out to sea or get around North Cape and get the island between them and the wind. So the official count, semi-official count, was about 74 vessels and 150 to 60 men killed in the Yankee Gale. My research suggests the number is higher, perhaps even as high as 120 vessels, and probably closer to 250 people killed. Most of them Americans, but not all. Descriptions of the storm at the time varied. This is a contemporary account. A gale of unusual violence from the east-northeast and a violent storm of rain, almost unparalleled in the history of this island. The islander, talking in the immediate aftermath, refers to how warm and still the afternoon was. The sky was heavily clouded, but yet no indication of the tempest, excepting a lurid, brassy appearance to the north and northwest about sunset. In the West Indies, the harbinger of a hurricane. This image, by the way, of the American mackerel fleet is actually stolen from 1882. But the islander recanted. In the aftermath of the storm, it chose to believe that it wasn't such a terrible storm after all. It blamed the loss of life, partly for political reasons, on bad vessels, badly managed. The storm continued an unusual length of time, but it was not severe, and the mischief was consummated within a few hours. On our northern capes, not a rickety outhouse has been injured that we have heard of, not hardly a breach made in the still more rickety stake fences. In short, we have heavier gales and higher tides almost every year without loss. As I said, partly political, partly because the British and the Americans were disputing access to the fishery inshore, partly the islander being the islander. James McNutt, who lived in Malpeque, recorded this in a diary, and thank you to the researchers who passed this on to me. Earl Lockerbie, I think, did this one. A great gale these 3 days, the worst in memory. The wind blowing from the north and by northeast, very heavy rain, waves crashing over the cliffs at the back shore, many wrecks, great devastation from the storm, some of the stacks of grain lost and waterlogged, no good for fish. So heavy rain destroying crops as opposed to wind knocking the crop down. But obviously, for James McNutt, it was a standout storm, and weather reports that I have found for the Bredor Lakes, I believe, indicates a weather bomb. The millibar drop in 24 hours was so considerable, the barometric pressure, to indicate a major storm that passed over Cape Breton, or perhaps just to the east of Cape Breton. Was it a hurricane? Probably not. Was it the residue of a hurricane? Probably. Do we know? No. So here's a little comparison of the August gale and the Yankee gale. The Yankee gale, 74 to 120 vessels, 150 to 250 lives. The August gale, a lot fewer vessels, but they're a lot larger. And reliably, I'd say somewhere between 115 and 150 deaths. So the second worst storm in island history in terms of the fatalities, and yet totally forgotten. I did an article on both of these storms for Island out the magazine, and you can always go find either one of these are available online if you want to know more about the storms. This is an illustration from the article on the August Gale. John Burden produced this one. By this time, islanders and maritimers were much more involved in mackerel fishing. Americans were still there in great numbers, but there was also a local mackerel industry. Mackerel was the most important industry in the fishery on Prince Edward Island in 1873. This is an image from 1882 of North Rustico. What you see in the bottom is going to be entirely flooded. Storm surge is going to completely isolate this area for something like 48 hours during the August Gale. The August Gale was a hurricane. Here's another image of North Rustico. As you can see, it was not a bustling village, and there's an empty liquor bottle there on the water. Here is Surrey. One of the differences between the Yankee Gale and the August Gale is that the Yankee Gale, most of the wrecks were St. Peter's westward to North Cape, whereas in the August Gale of 1873, a lot more of the wrecks were around East Point and North Cape, the two horns of the island. Here are some contemporary reports about the August Gale. This is the diary of an Anglican clergyman who was on his mission run up west during the August Gale. Wind increasing. This is like eyewitness account written in the diary the same time that he's looking at it happening. Wind increasing, it is blowing a gale. The trees are blowing to pieces, plums falling to the ground. Oh, how awful. It is now 10 p.m. No abatement. The house is shaking greatly. Reminds me of last year, Dorian. Still blowing gale. Oh, what will become of the poor fishermen? Oh, how the house shook. Could not sleep. I never felt a house shake as Miss Travers' new house did. Apple trees, plum trees, cherry trees blown and whipped to death. The extraordinary feature about this storm was the blasting character of the wind when at its height and the swell of the tide, the former scorching foliage like frost, and the latter carrying everything before it on the land from 50 to 100 yards. In other words, a huge storm surge and salt in the wind scorching crops. Keep those details in mind. Here's a chart of the August Gale, and I have recalibrated it. I think it passed over Cape Breton. There's no general agreement from weather historians about that, but it is one reading that I have seen. And there's such a storm surge that vessels were driven way up on the shore, sometimes 100 yards up on shore, and left high and dry once the storm receded. As I said, an Atlantic region event, not just a Prince Edward Island event, but particularly hard hit on the north shore of Prince Edward Island. It also flooded, it washed out the railway embankment in Charlottetown Harbor, destroyed wharves and fences, blew down buildings, and destroyed crops. Tremendous damage, and yet the August Gale quickly became forgotten. In fact, the curious thing is that within 30 years, some of the details reported in the press about the August Gale had reattached themselves, like gene transfer, onto the August Gale, the Yankee Gale. This is Steve Clement's engraving of a vessel aground on her beam ends from the Yankee Gale. Here's another image of the George Thresher work of art. Almost immediately, the Yankee Gale started getting turned into art. This painting is from 1852, I believe. Elizabeth Lockerbie, who would have been an eyewitness to the Yankee Gale, she was from Cavendish, published a book of poems, the centerpiece of which is a 40-page Evangeline-like extravaganza called George and Amanda. Spoiler alert, they don't get together at the end. Noting something which became part of the folklore, that the Yankee Gale was sent as retribution by a vengeful god because the Yankee fleet insisted on fishing on the Sabbath day. The other story, which was later recounted by Ellen Montgomery, it's recounted in all kinds of local histories, involves a vessel called the Franklin Dexter, which was wrecked, and four sons and I think a cousin were drowned. The captain came up, uh, totally devastated, recovered the bodies, put them on a vessel from the same area in Massachusetts called the Seth Hall, which had been, as it turns out, from the historical account, not from the folklore account, which had run aground but was refloated and repaired, loaded up with a cargo. And the newspapers report her departure from Rustico, going back to the United States. The folklore records the captain defying the elements to prevent him from sailing back home. And the Seth Hall did not make it home. It was lost at sea, never heard from again once it sailed out of Rustico Harbor. And that is newspaper account. So the captain's profane defiance of God and the elements came back to bite him. By the turn of the century, accounts of the Yankee Gale are like this, and I think I'll probably run out of time before I can finish. The following morning, Saturday, how memorable because so awful. Lawson was not, he was alive, but he was just barely born when the Yankee Gale happened. So this is a version gathered from oral accounts. Beach, seething, mass of foam, roar of the Gulf deafening. John McKinnon, in his sketchbook of Prince Edward Island, he sets the template for future accounts, and he takes Lawson and does him one better. What uproar, what disaster. The outlook was truly appalling. Vessels by the hundred dashed on the shore, blah, 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 blah. The beach, a maelstrom of foam, the rain almost a deluge. By the way, the August gale, there were 4 inches of rain accompanied that. The noise like a continuous peal of the most awful thunder. The land shook with tremendous impact, blah, 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 blah. Heard 10 miles away. Look what Walter O'Brien just paraphrased and literally stole from John McKinnon. He, Neil Matheson, F.H. MacArthur, all of these people found McKinnon's account a generation later, and they incorporated it into their oral histories of the Yankee Gale. But these details, look at this from McKinnon. On land, the damage was serious. The tide flooded areas never before seen underwater. On the fields where harvest had recently been gathered, waves flung their calves aloft, blah, blah, blah. These are not details from the newspaper reporting of the Yankee Gale. These are details from the newspaper recording of the August Gale. By the time McKinnon writes a sketchbook, the two events have fused. Oral history has fused with written accounts, and subsequently, it's very difficult to know whether what we're reading about in newspaper accounts is oral history or just straight stealing from McKinnon, or whether McKinnon is now fancified the accounts and they make their way into oral history. So written and oral history entwine. And this is a brief list of the various retellings of the Yankee Gale. Uncle Joe is probably F.H. MacArthur, to be honest with you. So the Yankee Gale persisted in popular memory, persists in newspaper accounts, persists in later memories and oral histories and community histories. But the point of the matter is that the August Gale is completely forgotten. Why? It seems to me that to be remembered, a storm has to serve a purpose. And the Yankee Gale had, in the beginning, a moral to it about the defiance of elements, about fishing on the Sunday. There's also only room in history for one big storm, in oral memory, I should say, for one big storm. And for Islanders, that storm is the Yankee Gale. Thanks for your time. Hope you go look up the articles and learn more for yourself about the remarkable story of these storms. Happy Seniors College. Someone turned the lights out on me while I was recording this. Hope you can see me.